Imagine an ordinary morning in a small coastal village. The waves are still rolling gently onto the sandy shore. The sun rises just like it has every other day, and the wind carries the familiar salty scent of the ocean. Everything feels calm, predictable, almost timeless. But what no one in that village realizes is that in a single moment everything could change forever. Not because of war, not because of a natural disaster, but because of what seems like a very small human decision. And there is a question that makes many people pause when they read this story in the Quran. Why did Allah not simply punish them with death? Why was it not a storm, an earthquake, or a disease sweeping through the village? Why was the punishment something far more unsettling, something that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it? A transformation. Human beings turned into creatures that looked somewhat familiar, yet were no longer human, in creatures that carried a resemblance to humanity, but had lost the dignity and status that Allah once gave them. That question forces us to think carefully. What could they possibly have done that was so serious? The story begins in a place that appeared peaceful, a village sitting right beside the sea where life revolved around the ocean. From the time they were children, the people of the village grew up watching fishing boats leave the shore early in the morning, and the men earned their living through fishing, and the small village markets were always filled with fresh fish. The ocean in front of them seemed endlessly generous. Fish appeared in such abundance that it felt as if that source of life would never run out. This village was not a struggling community trying to survive in poverty. On the contrary, they had been given many blessings. Their location was favorable, their resources were rich, and their work was stable. And they had food for their families, safety for their children, and a way of life that many people in other places could only dream about. But there is something human beings often forget when life becomes too comfortable. The things we call blessings are sometimes also tests. Allah has given humanity many favors, but within every favor there is also a hidden trial. When life becomes difficult, people tend to remember Allah more often. When loss happens, we pray more. When suffering arrives, and we search for comfort in faith. But when everything is easy, when money is sufficient and the table is always full of food, the human heart can fall into a very dangerous state. Forgetfulness. The people of that coastal village slowly grew used to their prosperity. Large catches of fish became normal. Successful market days became routine. Over time, they began to see these blessings as if they were simply the result of their own efforts, and they no longer saw the hand of Allah in every fish they caught, in every coin they earned, or in every breath they took each day. But Allah knows what human beings do not know. He knows what is hidden in their hearts. And sometimes Allah does not test people with poverty or hardship, but with the very comfort and wealth they enjoy. One day, a rule was given to that community. One day of the week was set aside for worship and rest. On that day, they were not allowed to go out and fish. And the command was clear, a simple limit, only one day. The other 6 days, they could continue their work as usual. At first, that rule did not seem like a very difficult test. One day of rest sounded completely reasonable. The sea would still be there. The fish would still be there. 6 days remained for them to work, but what happened next turned that simple rule into a test that the entire community had never expected. On the very day they were forbidden from fishing, something strange began to happen in the ocean. Fish appeared in huge numbers close to the shore, so many that the surface of the water seemed alive with movement. Large schools of fish swam near the coast, visible and easy to catch, as if the ocean itself were offering its gifts directly to the villagers. But that was exactly the day they were not allowed to touch them. Imagine standing on the shore and seeing an enormous opportunity right in front of you, and yet knowing you are not allowed to reach out. The ocean looked full of wealth, but the command of Allah stopped them for just that one day. Strangely, on the other days of the week, the ocean returned to normal. Fish were fewer and catching them became harder. It was not that the sea had no fish, but the overwhelming abundance of that one day was gone. Week after week, the same pattern repeated. Saturday came and the fish appeared everywhere, and the other days brought back the familiar struggle of daily work. At first, the villagers simply watched. They tried to control themselves. They reminded each other that this was the law of Allah. But temptation has a way of working slowly inside the human mind. When something forbidden is placed right in front of us again and again, day after day, the temptation does not become weaker. It grows stronger. It slips into our thoughts. It leads people toward dangerous questions, and not the question of whether they should obey Allah, but a different question. Is there a way to move around this limit while still appearing to follow the law? That is the moment when the story truly begins. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained, a place where we explore powerful stories from the history of the prophets and the lessons that Allah preserved for every generation. If you enjoy content like this, consider subscribing to support the channel and help us continue sharing meaningful stories in future videos. Because what happened next in that coastal village is not just an ancient story. It is a mirror, a warning. And when we look closely at it, we may realize that the test faced by that community did not end thousands of years ago. In many ways, it is still happening today, only in different forms. The real test of human beings rarely comes during dramatic moments, and it does not always appear as war, famine, or tragedy. Sometimes the greatest trials arrive in situations that seem completely ordinary, moments where a person must choose between personal convenience and obedience to Allah. For the community living by the sea, the test began with a clear command. They were instructed to observe the Sabbath, a day dedicated to worship and rest. On that day, they were not allowed to go fishing. The other 6 days still belonged to work, trade, and daily life, and only one day was set apart to remind them that life is not only about earning a living, but also about remembering the one who provided everything they had. At first, the rule did not trouble them. One day of rest seemed reasonable. The sea was still there. The fish were still there. 6 days remained for work. But Allah, who knows what lies deep in human hearts, designed their test in a very particular way. On the very day they were forbidden to fish, the sea became unusually full of fish. Schools of fish gathered close to the shore, so many that people could see them glimmering beneath the sunlight. The water seemed alive with movement. Large and small fish swam near the coast as if they were offering themselves to the fishermen's nets. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before. This was not just a good fishing day. It was an overwhelming abundance. If they had been allowed to fish that day, in only a few hours would have brought them a catch that normally required several days of work. But they were not allowed to touch them. They stood on the shore and watched. The boats remained still. The nets stayed rolled up. They knew the law of Allah, and they knew that day was not meant for profit. Yet inside their hearts, another feeling slowly began to appear. A quiet inner struggle that grew stronger with time. The following week, it happened again. Saturday arrived, and the sea filled with fish. Large schools swam close to the shore, so easy to catch that a single net could have captured dozens. The villagers watched again. Some turned away from the shore to avoid temptation. Others stood there longer, unable to take their eyes off the water. Then the Sabbath ended. When they returned to the sea the next day, the scene had changed. The fish were no longer everywhere. Fishing returned to its normal pace, sometimes even harder than before. Smaller catches forced many people to work longer hours to support their families. Then another week passed. Once again, the Sabbath came with abundance. The sea was full of fish again, swimming near the shore as if the ocean itself were calling to them. And once again, they could only watch. Week after week, month after month, the same pattern continued with almost cold precision. The forbidden day overflowed with opportunity. The permitted days offered only enough to survive, and this test was not random. It touched something deep within human nature. The desire for what lies directly in front of us but is forbidden. At first, many people in the village remained patient. They reminded one another that this was a test from Allah. But as time passed, that patience began to wear down. One man standing on the shore watched fish swim by and thought about the money he was losing. And another thought about his family and wondered why they should struggle while opportunity was swimming right in front of them. At first, those thoughts were brief, almost harmless. But when such thoughts repeat again and again, they begin to take root. Temptation works in subtle ways. It rarely begins by pushing someone to break the law immediately. Instead, it starts with small questions. Is it really necessary to be this strict? Is Allah not the most merciful? And are we not simply trying to provide for our families? These thoughts began spreading quietly through the community. And when many people begin thinking in the same direction, what once seemed clear can slowly become blurred. The law had not changed. The command of Allah was still the same, but inside the minds of some people the focus had shifted. Instead of asking how they could obey better, they began wondering whether there might be another way to approach the situation, and not by openly breaking the law. That would be too obvious and too dangerous. But what if there was a way to benefit from the opportunity while still appearing to obey? At first, those thoughts existed only in the minds of a few individuals. But sometimes it takes only one bold idea to change the direction of an entire community. And in that coastal village, that moment was approaching. Someone was about to suggest a plan that would seem clever, even brilliant. A plan that many people would convince themselves did not really break the law of Allah. Yet that very plan would open the door to a consequence none of them had ever imagined. Not every downfall begins with a large action. Many begin with a very small thought, a thought that appears clever, even reasonable. In that coastal village where Allah's test repeated week after week, that thought finally appeared. Someone began thinking differently. Not about openly defying the command of Allah, but about finding a way around it. If the Sabbath prohibited fishing, what would happen if they technically did not fish on that day? What if everything were prepared beforehand and the harvest happened only after the Sabbath ended? In appearance, they could still claim that they had not broken the command. At first, this idea existed only in the mind of one person, but sometimes it takes only one person brave enough to try something for others to quickly follow. Just one evening before the Sabbath began, that man walked to the shore. The sun was setting, and the sea was growing calm. He noticed large fish swimming near the rocks, almost as if they were waiting for the next day when the waters would fill with schools of fish. In his mind, the plan was already clear. He tied a rope to a fish swimming close to the shore and secured the other end of the rope to a large rock underwater. The fish was still alive. It could still swim, but it could not escape. And then he went home and waited. The Sabbath arrived. The village once again witnessed the familiar scene of countless fish near the shore. But that man did not sail out to sea. He did not cast a net. He did not fish. He simply allowed the rope and the rock to do the work. When the Sabbath ended, he returned to the shore. The fish was still there. He pulled it in, took it home, and prepared a meal for his family. Technically, he could say he had not fished on the forbidden day, and he had only taken something that had already been prepared beforehand. The smell of grilled fish soon spread through the village. The familiar aroma made the neighbors curious. They knew fishing had not been allowed the day before, and they also knew that the other days rarely produced such a catch. So they knocked on his door and asked him how he had obtained it. The man did not hide his method. In fact, he explained it with a sense of pride. He told them about the rope, the rock, and how he left the fish tied until the Sabbath had passed. He emphasized that he had not actually fished on the forbidden day. The reaction of many villagers was not anger. No one shouted that he had deceived the law. Instead, many were impressed. They looked at one another and realized they might have been missing an opportunity all along. Why should they stand on the shore watching fish swim past every week when there was such a simple solution? If they did not cast their nets on the Sabbath, and if they only prepared beforehand and collected afterward, then technically the law was still being followed. In a short time, the idea of one man became a method used by the entire village. Men began digging small channels that guided seawater into shallow pools near the shore. On Friday evening, they opened these channels. When the Sabbath arrived, fish swam in with the flowing water and became trapped in the shallow pools. The villagers did not touch them during the Sabbath, and they simply watched and waited. When the day passed, they returned and gathered the trapped fish. Large catches began appearing in their homes again. The village markets were once again full of fresh fish. Some people became even more creative. They built underwater barriers, placed nets in strategic locations, and designed increasingly complex trapping systems. Each week the traps were prepared beforehand, and each week they brought profit. And the most frightening part was not that they were committing a sin. The most frightening part was that they no longer believed they were doing anything wrong. In their minds, they were still obeying the law. They were not fishing on the Sabbath. They were maintaining the appearance of obedience. The only thing they had changed was the way they thought about the law. Gradually, the entire community began repeating the same words to one another. They said they were not breaking the command, and they had simply found a clever way to live with it. They convinced themselves that Allah could not blame them because technically they were still following the rule. But there was something they had forgotten. Allah does not only look at outward actions. He looks at the intentions inside the heart. Soon the villagers spent the Sabbath not in worship but in watching their traps. They walked along the shore checking whether fish had entered the pools. They discussed ways to improve their systems. Conversations that once centered on faith now revolved around profit. The Sabbath, once meant for remembering Allah, slowly became the center of deception. And the most dangerous thing about deception is that from the outside it can look very similar to obedience. The villagers could still claim that they were not fishing on the forbidden day. But deep inside, they knew the purpose of the command had been completely broken. A community that had once been given so many blessings was now walking a dangerous path. They believed they had found a way to pass the test without sacrificing anything. But they did not understand something important. The tests of Allah are never about appearances. They are always about the honesty of the heart. And when a community begins turning obedience into a game of clever loopholes, it is often a sign that they are very close to a consequence they never imagined. When a mistake begins to be accepted in a community, the first thing that changes is not the law itself, but the way people see the law. In that coastal village, fish traps gradually became a normal sight. At first, only a few people experimented with the idea, but over time, the practice spread throughout the community. What once caused hesitation slowly became ordinary. Conversations in the village began revolving around how to improve the traps, how to guide fish into the pools, and how to collect more after the Sabbath ended. But not everyone looked at this with approval. Different expressions began appearing among the villagers. Some people could not accept what was happening. They saw the channels dug from the sea to the shore, the underwater barriers and the nets prepared in advance, and their hearts felt heavy. They understood that the issue was not about which day the nets were cast. The issue was intention, and those traps had been built with a clear purpose, to take what Allah had forbidden on the Sabbath. These people began to speak out. They went from house to house telling their neighbors that what they were doing was wrong. They reminded people of the teachings of the prophets, warning that Allah cannot be deceived by clever wording or technical tricks. Some even stood near the shoreline where the traps were set and called for everyone to stop before it was too late. But their warnings were not received the way they had hoped. Many villagers began to view them with irritation. They said these people were exaggerating the situation. In their eyes, nothing was wrong. They were not fishing on the Sabbath. They were only preparing beforehand and collecting afterward. As far as they were concerned, the rule was still being followed. Some even mocked those who warned them. They said those people were too strict, too rigid, and they argued that such thinking did not understand the realities of life. When they looked at houses now full of fish and markets busy once again, they felt even more confident that their method could not possibly be wrong. Slowly, a division formed within the village. The first group was the one actively participating in the plan. These were the people digging channels, building barriers, and setting traps, and they believed they had found a clever way to maintain the appearance of obedience while still taking advantage of opportunity. With each passing week, they grew more confident in their smart solution, constantly inventing new ways to make their traps more effective. The second group consisted of those who openly opposed what was happening. They held firmly to the belief that the law of Allah was not something that could be bent to suit human desires, and they continued reminding and warning others even when their words were ignored. They understood that if they stayed silent, they would become part of the problem. But there was also a third group, and this group makes the story even more thought-provoking. These were people who did not participate in the traps, but also did not want to be involved in the conflict. They saw what was happening and knew something was not right, yet they chose to remain neutral. And they told themselves that they were not doing anything wrong, so there was nothing to worry about. When the people who warned others moved through the village calling for everyone to stop, it was often this third group who tried to stop them. They argued that the warnings were pointless. According to them, those violating the law would never change. If they truly were wrong, Allah would punish them himself, so there was no need for anyone else to interfere. On the surface, and those words sounded reasonable, but beneath them lay something else. The exhaustion of standing up for what is right and the comfort of remaining silent. When they heard these arguments, the people who warned others gave a simple but powerful reply. They said that they spoke out first so that one day they could stand before Allah and say they had tried. They had warned, they had reminded, and they had not turned away when they saw wrongdoing. But they also added something else, perhaps even if only one person listened. If even one heart changed, then their effort would already be worthwhile. As time passed, the tension within the village grew more obvious. Conversations became colder. Familiar paths now separated people with different beliefs. Eventually, the people who warned others felt they could no longer live among the deception surrounding them. They separated themselves from the rest of the community. According to some traditional accounts, they even built a physical boundary within the village, a wall dividing the community into two parts. On one side were those who continued their plans. On the other side were those who refused both to participate and to remain silent. Those breaking the command saw this and laughed. They said the others were only making their own lives harder. While they were earning more every week, the others continued living with small catches and a more difficult life. To them, and the prosperity they were experiencing seemed like proof that they were not doing anything wrong. But there was something they failed to understand. Wealth is not always a sign of Allah's approval. Sometimes it is simply extra time given to people, allowing them to continue further down the path they have chosen until the consequences of that path can no longer be reversed. The coastal village was no longer a united community, and it had become a place where different groups of people were walking separate paths, and each path was leading toward a very different ending. One morning, the atmosphere in that coastal village felt strangely different. The people who had separated themselves from the deception woke up as usual, but they sensed an unusual silence surrounding everything. There were no hurried footsteps heading toward the shore, no voices calling to check the fish traps, and none of the familiar sounds of a village beginning its day. At first, they assumed that perhaps the others had simply woken up late, but as time passed, the silence remained. The sun rose higher in the sky, and the shoreline still looked strangely empty. A feeling of unease began spreading among them. The men looked toward the part of the village where the violators lived, exchanging worried glances. Finally, one man decided to approach the wall that separated the two parts of the community, and the wall had stood there for some time as a symbol of division, but it had never felt as heavy as it did that morning. The man climbed up, placing his hands on the rough stones, and looked over to the other side. The moment he did, he froze. The people behind him asked what he saw, but he could not answer. He simply pointed ahead with a trembling hand, his face pale with shock. When the others climbed up and looked in the same direction, they saw something none of them could ever have imagined. Yet the streets that had once been full of people were now filled with strange creatures running around in confusion. The men, women, and children they once knew were gone. In their place were animals resembling apes, moving chaotically and making unfamiliar sounds. The familiar houses were still standing, but their residents were no longer human. For a moment, no one could believe what they were seeing. The scene before them was too impossible, too horrifying. But as they looked more carefully, the horror grew even deeper, because the creatures were not completely unfamiliar. They were inside houses the villagers recognized. One sat near the door of a home that had once belonged to a neighbor. Another crouched in the corner of a courtyard where a family used to live. Clothes still lay scattered around. Everyday objects remained where they had always been. The people standing on the wall slowly realized the most terrifying truth of all. These were not random animals, and they were the very people who had once lived among them. One man stepped down to the other side with trembling legs. He walked slowly forward, his heart heavy as he approached a creature sitting in the corner of a house. It was the house where his younger brother had lived. With a shaking voice, he called his brother's name. He asked whether the creature in front of him was truly his brother. The animal looked up. What everyone saw in its eyes left them speechless, and there was no wild emptiness there. Instead, there was awareness, shame, recognition. The creature nodded. Tears filled the brother's eyes. He stepped closer, and the creature also moved forward as if wanting to embrace him like before. But instead of words, only broken sounds came out, sounds that could not express apology, sounds that could not fully carry regret. According to classical traditions mentioned by scholars, those who were transformed still retained their awareness, and they recognized their families, their homes, and the people who had once been their friends. But they were trapped inside bodies that were no longer human. They understood what had happened to them, and that understanding became part of the punishment. The righteous people watched this scene with heavy hearts. They did not feel joy at the fate of those who had mocked them. They felt no sense of victory. They felt sadness and fear, and because what they were witnessing was not simply the punishment of a community. It was a powerful reminder of what happens when people try to turn obedience into a game of clever manipulation. Those who had been transformed did not live long in that state. Some traditions say they remained for only a few days, carrying a regret they could not express in words. Then they disappeared from this world, taken by the fate they had created for themselves. But their story did not disappear with them. Allah preserved it in the Quran so that it would never be forgotten, not merely as a record of the past, but as a lesson for every generation. Because what makes this story frightening is not only the punishment. What makes it frightening is how familiar the mistake feels. The people of that village did not believe they were rebelling against Allah. They believed they were simply adapting to the law. They kept the appearance of obedience while destroying its spirit, and that is exactly why their punishment took that form. An ape resembles a human being, yet it is not human. It looks like a distorted reflection of humanity, a twisted imitation of what a human is meant to be. Just like the way they lived. They carried the outward form of obedience while hiding deception inside. That story remains in the Quran today as a warning for anyone who believes they can hide the truth from Allah through clever interpretations. And the law of Allah is not a collection of words for people to play with. It is a call to the heart, a call to sincerity, and a call to honesty and faith. And the question this story leaves behind is not only for people of the past. It is for all of us. When we stand before the limits set by Allah, which path will we choose? The deepest lesson from this story is honesty with one's own faith. Faith is not about finding ways to live as close as possible to the edge of what is forbidden without crossing it. Faith is about accepting the limits set by Allah, even when doing so requires sacrificing immediate benefit. Applying this lesson today means asking ourselves a very simple but very important question. When we face a choice between what is right and what is profitable, are we looking for a way to obey the command of Allah, or are we trying to reshape that command to make it more convenient for ourselves? The story of that village ended long ago, but the test they faced still appears in the lives of all of us. It shows up in different forms, in our work, in our relationships, in the way we earn our living, and in how we treat others. If stories like this help you reflect more deeply on the history of the prophets, the moral lessons preserved in the Quran, and how those lessons can illuminate our lives today, and then you are welcome to join the community of Prophetic History Explained. This is a place where we explore meaningful historical stories together, understand the wisdom that Allah preserved for humanity, and learn how to apply those lessons in the modern world. And if you would like to continue exploring profound stories like this one, consider subscribing to Prophetic History Explained to support the channel and help us continue creating meaningful content in future videos.